Jeff Schloesser is a retired Major General who commanded the 101st Airborne. 15 months of that command was in Afghanistan, and he is the author of a new book called Marathon War. And he joins me now. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Dana. How are you today?
I'm very well, and thanks for talking to us about this. It's a great book. I don't want to blow smoke up your dress, but it's a great book that's referred to in the book. So I'm
to
allowed
all
to
the
use that.
listeners out there, you have to read Marathon War to understand what he just said.
Exactly. The curtain is closing on that war, and you wrote it was worth it. Was it really?
Great question, Dan, and it's one that I think we're going to continue to grapple with over the next decade. We went in there to do a very specific thing in the first year, which was really to bring justice on those that attacked our country in 9/11. And what we found out is that as we pushed out Al Qaeda and either captured or killed them or gave them a chance to reconcile, that what we found there was a land that was a potential, not only was it a failed state, but it was a safe haven. And so we had to stay longer. And the question of it is now as we withdraw, did we stay long enough?
You ended with a warning. If we let that country go back to those who would destroy us in our way of life, it will not be long, certainly not a generation, before they come looking for us again.
Yes. In Marathon War, I say basically that, we can turn our back, we can forget Afghanistan, but Afghanistan will not forget us. And I truly still believe that. The area there is so important to our national interests, but it's also, as I said, it's now going to, in my mind, be a failed state. And if that actually happens, they'll come to see us again.
You think it's going to crumble, that the Afghan army will not hold, that the Afghan government will not stick like glue? Not that it has anyway, but you feel pretty dire about how this is going to unfold once US forces and NATO forces and other contributing countries are out of there.
I think that, the United States and NATO, our allies there, as well as all the other countries that have participated over the last 20 years, have been the backbone for Afghanistan. It is still a country that it's not used to having a centralized government. It's a tribal country. The economy is still, after literally trillions of years, it is not unified, and there's a level of corruption there that is just incredibly difficult for most Westerners to understand. The answer is yes. I do believe that there will be a civil war. It may not be tomorrow or the next year or 2 years from now before the country begins, in a sense, to crumble, as you said. But I believe within 5 years' time, we'll find ourselves with a completely failed state and a safe haven again for those that want to attack us.
It's really tragic. I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead in the book a little bit, but I know you refer to some of these little school girls who were sprayed with acid when you were in command there, and that took place in Kandahar, I think. Some of them blinded, some of them couldn't go back to school, and that was the intention of the attackers. It kind of breaks my heart that, I mean, along with the fight, American soldiers really struggled in those patrols that we were on to go into towns and villages and open schools and open roads and try to get healthcare clinics rolling. And part of the good news were kids flying kites. Excuse my romanticism, but kids flying kites, which were banned under the Taliban, kids being allowed to go to school, girls being educated, starting to take a part in that society. And all of that now potentially rolls back.
I am deeply concerned about the human rights issue that I think we were going to see over the next several years. And you're absolutely right, Dana. When we first went to that country, very few children actually went to school. It's a little less than 1 million. As we left it, it's more, I think it's 4 times that now, with more than half of them being women or females. That potentially is all going to be lost. And, the last photo of that book, I specifically chose to be the last photo. And it's a young soldier from CJTF 101, one of our assigned troops. But anyway, he is actually giving some food to some young children, and they're laughing. And it wasn't staged; this was totally caught on camera in the middle of a combat zone. And it's all about the children. And I am deeply worried about the children of Afghanistan.
You talk about, the goals of the strategic plan for the war on terrorism, and you know something about that because you wrote in the book that you were part of the group to publish the nation's first operational strategic plan for the war on terrorism, and that you actually briefed President Bush on the plan. What was the goal? What was the headline?
Well, the first goal was obviously to, secure Afghanistan so it would never attack us again. The rest of the story, though, is to actually do that. In those days, what we thought would be necessary is that you had to secure not only against the enemy, or the insurgents or the terrorists, but you had to secure the people, make them feel like they could actually get up in the morning, work for a decent wage, and send their kids to school, and then also to link them to their government. So really, three broad goals: security, basically, economic development that led to jobs, and then education and medical improvements, and then finally linking all that back to a government that the Afghans could trust.
That didn't go well. That last part, definitely. But look, you draw some interesting parallels with Vietnam as well. And your father, he served in Vietnam?
He served 3 tours in Vietnam, yes.
And he never, you said in the book, never forgave politicians for walking away. Do you forgive politicians walking away today? You mentioned that the generals will be ultimately blamed, so you better have big shoulders. And you also talked about the fact that, they made the mistake of trying to hold everything rather than what was achievable in Vietnam. Did we just do the same in Afghanistan? Sorry, that's
I think
a
that's
big question.
That's a great question, Dan, and I think it's going to be explored over the next couple of years. But I think that if you look in the horizon, that's what it looks like. I mean, in a sense, the parallels between Afghanistan and Vietnam are really close. I mean, in some cases, there was a government that was fairly corrupt, unclear how much, it had been elected, how much it was supported by the people. There was a very strong insurgent group that was, pushing them. And then you had, the United States and our allies. We forget that we fought with many allies in Vietnam. And when we left, and then finally 2 to 3 years later, 2 years later, when we dropped all basically budget support, of financial support, it was no longer possible for that South Vietnamese government to basically survive. And essentially, what I hope does not happen, but it could. And unfortunately, I'm almost predicting that it might over 5 years' time, is the same thing in Afghanistan.
You were told in deployment you had to succeed in 2 theaters of operations, Afghanistan and Pakistan. The latter was very gray, was it not? I mean, were there clear, orders to go forward into Pakistan, or you kind of had to flirt along the border with Pakistan and sometimes carry out a drone strike in hot pursuit?
Absolutely gray area. The guidance that we received was fairly clear from my boss at the time, General McKiernan. And yet most of the U.S. structure did not exist. I make a point in Marathon War that I went to Pakistan with, my staff several times. And over a period of time, we started with a terrible relationship. They were basically supporting insurgent attacks across our border, and we had a very bad relationship, military to military, with them. I think over 15 months, as I write about Marathon War, I felt at the end of it that we had made huge progress. Obviously, it was not enough.
And you blame the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, is playing a double game.
I absolutely do. In fact, I mean, I often think that many of the senior military officers that I dealt with from Pakistan actually didn't know the level that this ISI directorate was playing within their own country as well as within Afghanistan. So I can't point my finger to them, but it's very clearly it had support at the very highest levels of Pakistan.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point in there, because we often kind of say Pakistan does this, or Pakistan didn't do this, or Pakistan's playing a double game. But in fact, you made the case that it was pretty tough on the military, probably on the front lines of the border in Pakistan, because they weren't quite sure, who had their back and who had a knife in their back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's easy for us in the West and America to forget that this was actually a frontier. Winston Churchill, I mentioned in Marathon War that one of my favorite books was The Malacan Field Force by Winston Churchill, Lieutenant Winston Churchill, who served in that area back in those days. it was just as much a frontier in the northwestern portions of Pakistan then as it is today, basically. And so they did not have all control as far as the U.S. Or the Pakistani military, for sure. It was there was several double games being played in that area. I dare say it's the same right now.
I was, in Afghanistan a dozen different times, and I always used to hear it, and it became cliche to some extent that, the spring comes, the bad guys come over the mountains from Pakistan, the Taliban, they carry out their attacks. Winter comes, the number of attacks go down again, and they retreat back into the frontier lands of Pakistan. But I remember flying in a helicopter with you over Afghanistan, and you said, it's not quite clear to me that it quite operates that way. It's more complex than that. They smuggle weapons through the winter. They stock weapons ready for the spring. Some of them melt back into the local populations. And that is probably a much more realistic take on what was happening. And then you talk a lot about what happened in, and forgive me for the pronunciation, Wanat.
Yes. Yeah, so for an example, well, Dan, first of all, I treasure those times flying there with you. I mean, that was actually, if you recall, it was a stunningly beautiful day, and what a great way to see it by helicopter. Afghanistan is a land of contrast, beautiful, and yet in many ways it can be horribly difficult to be able to survive in that country. Well, I tell you, I mean, let's go to Wanat for an example. I mean, there were several lessons learned. It's still one of the most studied stories in the U.S. Military, for sure. The lessons that most of us learned there is that that whether it was the winter, whether it was the late spring and the snows and stuff like that, but the enemy gets a vote, and they can fight well as well, and they can figure out ways to get around most of the things that we regard as military advantages in the West or in the U.S. Army. And they did so in that fight. I mean, and I every day I wake up and think about those soldiers that were killed and those that were horribly wounded. They fought with a great honor, but the enemy fought fairly well too. And it was just it's just an example of how good that unit was, that they actually, the U.S. And the Afghans and the few Marines that were over there, that they actually were able to fight that back and overall hold that day.
What makes that battle different? Like, this is July 2008. 9 U.S. soldiers die in an attack by roughly 100 Taliban. There are a couple of dozen more, I think about 20 more U.S. soldiers wounded. And you write
Yes.
that there are few battles as bloody and heroic.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, for Afghanistan, I think that 20 years of drudgery, going out and patrolling, coming on back, getting a rocket attack, maybe somebody else being hurt via that way, that can just lead to this idea that there was no great heroism in Afghanistan. In fact, there were several battles. This was the one most notable, where these soldiers fought and fought and fought against almost all odds, and certainly against they were definitely outnumbered. And that's what makes that one, I think, a little bit special. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the amount of awards, medals, and things that came out of that for heroism is absolutely incredible for the 20 years of Afghanistan that we've seen.
But you wrote this was well planned, and that the enemy was probably well entrenched in that village, and that the village worked with them and assisted them. This wasn't just a case of insurgents coming across the mountain.
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, and that's where we got it wrong. I mean, there's no doubt that we made the wrong decisions about what we thought was possible in that village. We actually thought we were going to insert, following counterinsurgency doctrine at the time, get right inside the villagers and help them do those three things. I mean, help secure them, help link them to the government, and then help economically. Gosh, did we get it wrong? And that caused me to, Dana, to take a hard look at everything else we were doing for the remainder of the 12 months that we stayed there in Afghanistan. Look most of with a jaded view into every village and every site that we had to just see, did it make any sense for us to be there?